Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro Podcast. Today, I am pleased to welcome onto the show Wendong Zhang. He is assistant professor at Cornell University and at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. He's also an extension economist. He and I met at an event a couple weeks ago in Fort Myers, Florida. I really loved his presentation, and he was willing to come on the podcast and discuss some of his work. I said this in the description of the episode, but if you are looking for someone to tell you whether tariffs are good or bad, you have come to the wrong place. If you are looking for objective analysis about the potential impact of tariffs, both good and bad, you have come to the right place. I want to thank Wendong so much for coming on. We recorded on Wednesday, February 19th. We're not going to set on this podcast episode for too long, but it may be a couple days before this comes out. And there's not a whole lot that is mission critical here. This is talking about tariffs more broadly and some of the impacts. So maybe we'll save it for the next time there's a juicy tariff announcement, which is basically once a week at this point. Listeners, if you want to hear more, if you want to talk about whether I can come speak at your event, if you want access to my Substack, if you want to talk about wealth management services, if you want to give me a book to read, jacob@jacobshapiro.com. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. Enjoy the revving up of the podcast. As you can tell, we are responding to the events in the world by churning out more episodes. So get ready. Cheers. See you out there. All right. Well, we have a newly minted American citizen on the podcast to talk about the impacts of Donald Trump's trade war. How is it going this morning? And coming from Warren Hall on the campus of Cornell University, which I'm just happy, looking out at the screen. Most of the listeners won't be able to see it, but it's a pleasure to welcome you onto the podcast.
Yep. Great to be here, Jacob.
I didn't ask you this before. I didn't. Where did you grow up in China, by the way?
Yeah, so I grew up in northern part of China in a province called Shandong province. To help your listeners, it's between Beijing and Shanghai. It's a coastal province. It's across the sea to South Korea.
If you don't mind the personal question, are you thinking you're going to settle in the United States forever, or do you hope to go back to China after an academic career? I don't. It's probably not that normal. I would expect for a Chinese citizen to try and come to the United States and get citizenship now in the particular geopolitical climate. No.
Yeah, so I think that emotionally, there's definitely a push and pull factors. So some of the factors that would attract us to go back to China more often are all my relatives and my younger brother and my parents-in-law are all in China. So we are sort of like alone. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in the U.S. Although two of my kids are born in Ohio and Iowa, so I describe them as American girls who can speak Chinese. We definitely want to visit more, but the work environment is not very good. So especially for Chinese university, is a way more hierarchical, and many places are very hostile work environments. I've been in the U.S. for 15 years. That's sounds too complicated for me, and their
Oh,
pay is not as high as American university.
well, that also helps. Well, we're glad to have you. I let's talk a little bit about what we're here to talk about. You published a great paper about the actual impact of tariffs on the U.S. and China, on Canada, Mexico, and I loved your paper. And don't take this the wrong way, because it was so dry and it was so sober. There was none of the politics. It was just like, look, if it's this tariff, we calculate on our model, it's this impact. If it's this tariff, it's this impact. It's like a very, very refreshing thing to read after everything that is in the news. You published, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes, by the way, for those who are interested with it, published on January 28th, 2025. And you go through 6 different scenarios. You go through US and China tariffs, 60%. You go through, sort of 2019 trade war and an additional 10%. You model the 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, blah, blah, blah. My first question that I wanted to pose to you, though, was, has Trump already thrown a huge monkey wrench into your models? Because did you model the 25% steel and aluminum tariffs in here? What about the reciprocal tariff that he announced just a couple of days ago? Do these things just break your model and make you want to light your hair on fire and go and redo all the work? Or do you feel like the models that you created will help us explain the impact, even if it was not the specific tariff scenarios that you planned for?
Right. So two answers. One is that yes, there are more fluid situation that we actually have published papers about the 2018-2019 paper, if you remember, that
Mhm.
started with the steel and aluminum tariff on everyone. And so uh, I think we are actually talking. We probably need to do a part two, which do separate scenarios on steel and aluminum, but also on the reciprocal tariffs. That, in case you don't know, that President Trump is essentially proposing to say that the example he used is that India, for example, charge a higher tariff on American auto industry, and it's not fair. So we should charge the higher tariff rates that India is charging the U.S. ones on the Indian products. And this is he's proposing to ask the USITC and Department of Commerce essentially to come up with plans to figure out where the disparity doesn't align. So where then there's a reciprocal, so make all these equal. So what is uncertain is that it's hard to imagine that um, all the countries will take this and say, okay, so that's fine. So it takes a higher rate. So there's this potentially could trigger retaliation, which then cause further imbalance, and whether we'll see like a tit for tat. And so it'll be interesting to see how much of this is um, a negotiation tactic and how much is actually implemented. But yes, that we need to probably do a part two of the analysis. What is interesting is a friend of mine, a former colleague, at plus jury at University of Nebraska, and many others at Peterson Institute and International Economics have done these scenarios. They have done the scenarios in October or November. If you're looking at the scenarios they're working with, and they're mainly looking at probably 60% of the tariffs on China and 25% tariff, or not even that, or 10% tariff on everyone. So given that our scenario looking at the specific rates with China and Canada and Mexico are actually fairly close to choose if this gets ended up being implemented. So I think it's still relevant. But I think what is really important from this analysis is that you can potentially draw lessons from um, both depending on your political view, you can draw insights, and or you can find supporting evidence for your views, uh, despite regardless of which your view is, right? So if you do not like President Trump's policy, our analysis of all these six different scenarios that involves a myriad of tariffs and retaliation by China, Mexico, Canada, and which you see some of those play out in the news already, is that this could cause a significant turbulence in the trade flows, and this will be causing economic damages for not only foreign countries but also U.S. countries as well, right? So there's economic loss from this tariffs for all the parties involved. When U.S. is imposing tariff on China and China retaliates, all the other players will benefit, but U.S. and China will lose. If U.S. engage in sort of a North American fight with Canada and Mexico, China will benefit, and Canada or Mexico will suffer, but also U.S. economy. If you like President Trump's policy, this analysis also give you some credence why he is potentially doing this way. Because if you're looking at the magnitude of the impacts of all these proposed tariffs and retaliations, U.S. will suffer less, even though there are losses for both sides. U.S. economy, because it's much larger, at least by percentage wise, that in terms of the percentage loss of GDP, would be much, much less compared to, for example, Canada, right? So in one of the scenario we analyze, if U.S. and engage in uh, a trade war with Canada and Mexico alone, and Canada could lose, say, like a 3.5% of the real GDP in the long run. Suppose this will be imposed as for like forever. Right? The U.S. loss will be, say, 0.2% of the GDP. It's still very substantial because the pie, but the sheer the relative magnitude is it is indeed smaller, right? So I think that that's one of the interesting lessons to draw. And two is that which maybe this help understand the negotiation that uh, from that perspective, based on the politics, there's the even the economic argument potentially would argue for like a potential more concessions from other countries, right? What is also interesting is that we find that if if Canada retaliate in the tariffs, their economy will actually be hurt more
Hmm.
than uh, the just suffering the U.S. Tariffs without retaliation. I have to clarify that all the country will retaliate no matter what, right? Because there's not only about economic loss, it's about political messages, but how you do it is different, right? So in the case of Canada, that their economy will actually suffer more because they're also U.S. products that the Canadians are buying as well. If you engage in retaliation, there's a significant shock on the Canadian currencies that will resulted in further economic loss. So one of the reason for the smaller magnitude U.S. loss is because that when all the major economy are engaged in trade wars, then it's this tremendous policy uncertainty, as we see in the case of COVID, that actually ended up boosting the U.S. currencies and make your U.S. dollars a little more stronger if you try to buy, international products. So there's some offsetting effects of that, right? Um, what is also interesting in what has already happened is that if you look at the Chinese responses, there are some flavors of their retaliation is there, but it's very, very short. It's not the real responses, right? So this is sort of saying that we have to retaliate, um, but they also don't want to engage in a full blown trade war. So they're hoping to see whether there's negotiation rooms. Um, uh, so Jacob and I both presented at a conference for um, large farms ag executives in Florida, and we did a poll about what the participants think will happen. I think what is interesting is um, people think, uh, you know, most people think that the U.S.-China trade war will likely to be real, and the U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade war may not be, right? So we'll see whether how much this will play out. But it's very interesting to see how, as you mentioned, that what we intended for this very dry, long 50 some page policy brief is you hear enough political commentary. We want to give you some baseline numbers so you can think about, right? Um, and we also want to be using as realistic trade policy scenarios as possible. So given the retaliation tariffs, for example, if you're reading the current analysis, we are assuming that U.S. tariff on all Canadian products is at 25% tariff. The actually announced policy is only 10% on oil
Hmm.
and gas of Canadian product going to the US, which is actually a significant chunk of the trade. And so that's recognizing the significant, or at least in a short term, there's a need for these products, right? Which in a sense, then there is some overestimation of the impacts in our current model as well. So we're working to thinking about whether we need to whether and how we update some of the analysis, but also, as Jacob noted, that because the new proposals, they're likely we need to do sort of a part two to look at, especially the reciprocal tariffs on everyone.
Yeah, that's a great way to lay it out. And I mean, I'll just underscore a couple of things you said. First of all, the fact that people can use this data to buttress whatever argument they want. Like, you know, people can say, "Oh, this is an anti-argument." They can also use it as a pro-argument. I think that's really important. Also, I think you also really underscore that. I mean, you know, when we say roughly, you know, 0.9% of China's GDP might decline, and that 0.45% of US GDP might decline. Those are relatively small figures. I think people will hear
Right.
that and say, well, that's not really that much. Is that really going to impact me on a daily level? It seems to me that the honestly the scenario that seems most impactful is you when you talk about the global trade war scenario, you talk about how it's really Canada and Mexico that could suffer massively, like an almost 10% drop in Canada's GDP, an almost 6% drop in Mexico's GDP. So how do you square all of the angst about tariffs then? Because like let's say it's the US China trade war and they slap on the tariffs as high as possible and we're talking about 0.5% of US GDP. Like that doesn't sound like a whole heck of a lot. So what am I missing there? Is that a bigger number than I'm giving it credit for?
Right. So the first that the reason for the Canadian and Mexican economy loss is because that because of NAFTA and USMCA, that the three economy are essentially operating on a zero tariff, a very close to zero tariff trade, right? So it's having a 25% increase is a dramatic shock to the system that nobody really anticipated, right? So that's why you see a much larger response. Um, uh, yes, I think if you're looking at the magnitude, you need to bear in mind that this is sort of the interpretation should be this. This is the longer term impacts. We're not projecting, this is the economy will be 25, 26, or 27. This is saying that is relative to your long term potential. This is a permanent loss compared to it. You'll be on a different trajectory. So you will be losing. So suppose that U.S. economy lose 5%, then this model essentially is saying that if this policy is putting on for a significant amount of time, then you're losing 5% every year, roughly, right? So and uh, uh, another thing is that the economy are so big, so that if you're looking at rather than percentage, but looking at the welfare impacts based on the amount of money that's dramatic, right? Because that we're talking about uh, the world's largest economies, U.S., Canada, having significant losses that means a lot. And also another thing that is potentially relevant is that the retaliation will not be felt equally across the US economy by sectors. So
Mhm.
when you're thinking about the retaliation that we have analyzed the 2018, 2019 US China trade war, for example, right? Um, China and many other countries will retaliate on uh, products that US has a trade surplus. So and in that context, the farm or agricultural and food products tends to be the prime targets of any trade retaliation. So we have seen that it's not necessarily has to do with President Trump. When President Obama imposed tariff on Chinese tires in 2009, 2010, China retaliated on poultry products. So
Mhm.
those are the sort of chicken feet exported to China as cultural delicacy, right? And so what they want to do for China, Mexico, Europe and Japan, when they retaliate, they're savvy enough to know where I can hit you economically, right? So that's where they want to find the products the U.S. holds a trade surplus, and for those products, you actually see much larger impacts. So you could see like 20 to 25% of the trade losses, especially initially, and things could be worse when you have these players um, involved in the trade war as your top export destination. And Canada, if we're thinking about these economies, right? China, Canada, Mexico, these are the top export destination for the U.S. Agricultural products, but general products as well, right? So if you're thinking about certain exports, then this could be capturing your significant amount of the market share. It could be even half. And when half of your customers are engaged in tariffs and trade war with the U.S., and your particular sector's loss could be substantially larger than the overall GDP, right? And overall welfare and GDP impacts are not as big. Another thing is that because the U.S. currency is the world currency, right? So when there's a turmoil in the world, the U.S. dollar tends to be stronger. That help the sort of the valuation of the U.S. economy as well, right?
Yeah, that's also such an important point, um, because I think a lot of the responses that I hear when I talk about tariffs and the potential damage to different sectors of the U.S. economy is that, well, but they're also the currency is going to work itself out, or we're going to devalue the dollar, and you hear Trump officials talking about how they're going to devalue the dollar and all these sorts of pie in the sky things. Where, to your point, and even to things that Trump said on the campaign trail before he was elected, he wants the dollar to be the global reserve currency. So on the one hand, they're pursuing trade wars to try and improve the position of U.S. exports, but at the same time, they also want to buttress the dollar as a global reserve currency, which makes U.S. exports not competitive. So it almost feels like there's a left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. You mentioned agriculture. Are there other sectors that are particularly exposed to these trade war scenarios?
I think that if you're thinking about a lot of the products, there's the retaliation tends to look at products that they could impose economic cost, but also send a political message. So agricultural products tends to be the one that is really salient, and occasionally there could be some impacts on the airline industry
Hmm.
because they really want to send a political message, and often the technology firms could also be impacted through the market access agreements. So China actually retaliated. They recently announced they will launch an investigation into Google. So there's some are using tariffs, some are using market access, and so so often it's the non-market, non-market, non-tariff barriers and the market access granting that or renewing your permit and things like that. It's tends to be even more important.
China, in particular, has a pretty big chokehold on the refining of lots of different mineral commodities that are critical to the modern industrial economy. They've talked about holding back some of those exports in retaliation. They haven't actually done it. It's been more about collecting information and requiring licenses and things like that. Is that another area that you expect that China will push, or is that more of a threat, you think, as we get into a negotiation process?
I think we have seen that. I do think there could be um, retaliation of that sort, right? So China have over the past few years, especially since the 2018 2019 trade war, China have uh, sort of beefed up on a lot of they have stashed a lot things more into their toolbox, sort of
Hmm.
by learning how U.S. regulators act, right? So China now created some of the entity list, right? So before. there are certain firms that China can list or take off from those lists, and often those are related to chips or other other manufacturing firms. And I think we have seen China uh, use the rare earth mineral exports ban. I think we'll see some of that playing out. Another thing I want to point out is that we have also done research looking to Chinese trade disputes with or political tensions with smaller countries in terms of economy and political significance. So Norway, Philippines, and Australia. Right. So Norway give a political dissident in China a Nobel Peace Prize. China announced that your Norwegian assignment is no longer up to the sanitary standards for China, and essentially shut off the imports of Norwegian salmon for about 6, 7 years. And when Australia and China um, didn't have a really good political relationship, China retaliated on Australian coal, um, beef, and many other products as well. Right. So what and China now has launched a anti-dumping investigations against Canadian canola, for example,
Hmm.
and so they have used that when Canada detained one of the top executives of Huawei, if you remember, a couple of years ago. So there's increasingly China is more vocal and more willing to use these actions, and often these actions are not necessarily tariffs; it's non-tariff related measures, and using measures such as the photosanitary standards, and saying that I'm not saying that you cannot export to China, but your top two firms now need more evidence that their products are meeting our
Hmm.
sanitary standards, and that review can take potentially 3 to 6 or years, right? So that another thing we have seen is there's a possibility of China is willing to wait for the change of administration for these smaller countries. Given that, when China is dealing with a trade dispute or economic dispute with the U.S., they're way more cautious. I think
Hmm.
they're less willing to engage in these sort of tactics.
Makes sense. Um, you had a couple different scenarios that you outlined in your paper, and I wanted to ask. I mean, I know we're only 4 weeks into the Trump administration. I can't believe it's only been 4 weeks. But one of your scenarios was sort of a global trade war scenario. Do you think we're in that scenario, or is it too early to say that we've entered the global trade war scenario?
I don't think we're in that yet. So I think we are still watching to see how much of these negotiations are really negotiation tactics, right? So even the tariffs on Canada and Mexico are pushed until next month. So we'll see whether there will be realized deals or resolutions so that those won't be put on, right? And the discussion on reciprocal tariffs. So there are two scenarios that is being floated out. That is sort of the world trade war scenarios. One is a recent one that we discussed earlier. It's the reciprocal. Is that you charge us 50%, I only charge you 5% for the same products. I will increase the tariffs for your products 50%, right? So that's the recently proposed plan. There's another plan that President Trump announced during the campaign is imposing 10% tariffs on all imports, regardless of which this is coming from, right? I think both could be really, really significant. And when you're looking at these impacts, so you talked about we have analyzed that in that scenario that um, the scenario 6 in a paper, which we essentially says that now this is sort of a full blown trade war, was U.S. engaging in trade war with China, adding 10% with Chinese retaliation, adding 25% tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and they retaliate, and adding 10% of the tariffs on the rest of the world, and the rest of the world retaliate, right? So, and if you're looking at those, there are significant impacts on several of the factors. So, I will give you the so if you dig into the paper, the table 10 give you the sector output in the US. So a lot of the oil seeds, which include soybean, for example, will lose 17 to 18% in this scenario. So a lot of the
Hmm.
loss are um, based on agricultural products, actually. But there are also, if you're looking at the petroleum, the coal and the oil products, it's also declining significantly, 9%. Um, and some of the metal sectors are also hurt significantly as well. Rubber and plastics, transport equipment, these sectors are down, including electrical equipment, down 8 to 12%. So there are significant loss in this, not only in agricultural sectors, but also in the in the manufacturing sectors. And in this, that the U.S. economy will see a slowdown or decline of 22% drop in exports. And
Hmm.
so there's a significant loss in the scenarios in the um, world trade war, right? And but many countries will lose in these like massive trade impacts, and China will also lose in this scenario as well. So Chinese um, exports will lose about 1 to 2%. And the when you are thinking about the uh, the the real GDP, for example, in this, that both U.S., Canada, and Mexico will lose. The U.S. will lose about 0.4% of their real GDP. China 0.2%. Canada and Mexico will lose more, about like a 2-3%. Right, and many other countries will gain from this, because this is assuming there's a lot more higher tariffs and major fights between US and Canada and Mexico. And so I don't think we're there yet, but there's a real danger, because there's a different version of those got proposed. I don't necessarily There's a lot of pushback also, that when we are thinking about the rest of the world, um, how did this whether the U.S. allies will get a differential treatment, right? So I think that a lot of the U.S. allies are alarmed by the willingness of President Trump imposing tariff on Canada, right? So if we if you think about that, you are a real ally of the U.S., right? So, and we can always think about some of the political disagreements between Germany and U.S. or France with the U.S. You can hardly think of any political strife between U.S. and Canada. Right? So
Hmm.
and that these trends are some of the things that are not necessarily in the traditional thinking of what is within the scope, right?
Exactly. Who we've talked about the losers. Who are the winners in some of these scenarios? So what sectors are winners, or what countries are winners in the context of this trade war? Whether it's just the United States and China going after each other, or if it does become this larger global trade conflagration.
Right. So that's a very good question. And I mentioned that depending on who we're engaging in a tariff and trade war fights, all the players involved in this are losers, and the other players are the winners. Right.
Hmm.
So who are not affected, or who are not got imposed by these tariffs? If we forget about the worldwide tariffs, um, all most of the discussion of the tariffs are on Canada, Mexico, and China. So all the other players essentially are the winners and the beneficiaries of the fights. So some of the notable ones, Brazil, right? So Brazil, the real GDP in almost all scenarios will increase and range from about like a 0.1%, a 0.1% boost to a 0.7% boost. Vietnam, right? So you can think of a lot of those when you are fighting with when US are engaging in trade war with the other players, then when the US farm exports are hurting, who are supplying these farm products? That one of the major suppliers is Brazil. Right. So Brazil is already number one in soybean exports and slated to become even more significant for even corn as well. EU as well. So EU, if these plans are going out and if there's no U.S. and EU trade war, then we'll also see many of the European unions also benefit. But again, that because that the economy is much larger, so the percentage-wise gains is not as large as Brazil is. Sans, it's like a 0.04% to 0.13% increase in real GDP. Um,
Mhm.
and Vietnam will also benefit through this, not only through, potentially uh, when there's a fight, there's a potential cheaper products that's coming from Canada or the US or China. So these things that they can buy, but also they can boost their exports, right? So their economy will also benefit from this. So so that's some of the major beneficiaries, and UK too, right? So UK, Australia. So depending on who else is not included in the fights, everyone who engaged in the tariff war lose. All the other players essentially will benefit. That's a broader message, and the major beneficiaries would be Brazil, EU, UK, and Vietnam.
Interesting. Um, I know that what I'm about to ask you is an impossible question, but based on what you have seen so far from the Trump administration, what do you expect to happen for the next couple of months? Do you think that this is all part of a broader negotiation process? Are you seeing things that make you think that no, like the US government is extremely serious about carrying these trade wars to the very end until they get whatever concessions that they want? How is your analysis informing what you're seeing from a policy perspective that's coming out of the White House and even out of some of the responses to what the White House is doing?
Right. So first, a disclaimer. Economist, and so there's two caveats. One is that you may have heard the saying that the economists have predicted the 9 out of the 5 last recessions. So it tends to be the doom dismal disciplines. But I do think that, for example, the U.S.-China trade war likely will be carried out at least in some scale. So how significant they are, we're not sure, and this is in part related to the political climate. I have also done research related to foreign ownership of U.S. farmland, for example, and you can see how much political reaction that is over Chinese ownership of U.S. farmland. So, in case you don't know, there's about 3.4% of the land that is owned by foreign countries, and Canada rather than China as a top foreign country where the companies and individuals are buying U.S. land. And among the foreign buyers, then China represents less than 1% of that. So it's a very, very tiny share, but the political reaction is a lot more significant. Another thing, another alarming evidence I see is not only tariffs, there are congressional representatives now proposing potentially ending the normal trading relationship, permanent normal trading relationship status for China. And if that becomes reality, that sort of it's equivalent to increasing tariffs on many
Mm,
of the sectors, even more damning because it's not just the executive action by the president, then the next president kind of correct. right? So this would require congressional votes, and to get back on the normal trading relations, then that requires some congressional actions as well. And you can see that it's very very hard to get any congressional agreement and actions on any topic, and something that re-granting China this status doesn't necessarily seem very likely if this ended up happening. So that's I think there are some the alarming situations. I do think there are certain elements of the trade war will happen. Likely, the steel and aluminum potentially will be carried out. Whether we'll have a sustained long term trade war with Canada and Mexico, I think I'm less convinced. I think that seems to be a lot due to non-trade related issues, fentanyl and immigration enforcement, um, and if those are showing the progress the administration want to see, that we may not see much action. I do want to point out that we have analyzed the 2018 2019 trade war, that the we have a much better understanding of the political support for these trade actions. So we have done surveys of farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota, and so in the middle of the trade war in 2019. So what we find is that uh, about two-thirds of the respondents are supportive of President Trump's trade war then, um, even though they realize this will lead to economic loss for their farm, right? And later on, I think that we discover there's a short-term pain, long-term gain mentality. Um, Two is that if you're looking at the data of how the trade aid payments are actually allocated, if you recall, so this is called the Market Facilitation Program, MFP trade aid payments. Um, they sort of confirms the farmers' at least request or conjecture that there is a long-term gain, or because that Iowa economy roughly suffered $2 billion loss from the tariff and trade war with China, right? And then they got about over $4 billion of subsidy that is coming as the direct federal ad hoc payments. So if this further continue on, I think we'll see similar sort of things like that happening. Um, and the payments tends to be clustered on rural and agricultural states where the funds essentially are coming from the treasury. So if you live in more populous states, right? So California, Texas, and New York, right? So implicitly, you are footing the bill more compared to the rest of the country. But if you're in a rural states, right, like Iowa, that you actually saw the economic gain, right? So the farm payments, government payments to the agricultural sector, typically it's less than $10 billion a year, and during the first Trump administration in 2019 2020, that at one point it reached about $46 billion because of the trade aid payments and COVID CFAP payments as well. If this plays out, I think there's a important inter-country, state-specific political economy that is going on, and some of the political scientists also look into, you know, how does this translate into congressional election outcomes as well, right? So there are there's definitely economic rationales for certain groups, significant support for the trade actions, right?
Hmm. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I feel like I learned something, so I hope the listeners will learn too. If they want to get more from you, where should they find more of your work? I'll of course have a link to the paper in the show notes. But if people want to follow your work, where's a good place to follow more of it?
Yeah, I think I have a website, so I will share with you. Maybe you can add to
Of
to
course.
the resources you shared. Contact me by email at wendongz@cornell.edu is preferred. I have extension duty, so I'm happy to speak with your group and talk with you on the phone and present. If you have any specific question, if you have some question that is puzzling you and you want some answers, let us know. And we want to know what is the question that people care about so that we can do, policy relevant and research as well.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about the wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or at Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob, SHAP, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.